Good morning. So we are starting Forensics Chapter 2 today. It's a pretty short chapter. The first part is crime scene investigation. The second part is about specifically evidence collection. So there's a brief video. It's about 7 minutes long. I would like you to watch. It says in your assignment to watch it as a separate assignment. It's actually embedded. This is the introductory JonBenét Ramsey case video. Enjoy.
The whole JonBenét thing, you see it on TV all the time. All of the terrible things that can happen to people. I was her age. She would be my age now. She would be pursuing her own career. Once you realize, she never got to grow up.
Back then, Thumper Gosney was JonBenét's friend and competitor on the Kitty Beauty pageant circuit.
JonBenét was the nicest girl. She was very poised in all of her things she did.
Here in the foothills of the Rockies is the town where JonBenét Ramsey grew up. Boulder, Colorado, a quirky college town described by locals as 25 square miles of fantasy surrounded by reality.
We assumed we were living in a little town and that evil existed elsewhere.
The year was 1996. The Macarena at the top of the charts.
I love books.
Oprah started a book club. The country had just re-elected President Bill Clinton. As for the Ramseys, John and Patsy, 6-year-old JonBenét, and big brother Burke, age 9, they were the very picture of the good life. Wealthy, thanks to John's thriving computer business.
Patsy was a high society woman from Atlanta who knew how to decorate her house. John was a smart guy who had just been nominated or voted as Entrepreneur of the Year. So really the two of them were high society for Boulder.
Patsy had just beaten ovarian cancer and was celebrating her 40th birthday. This was a Christmas that promised to be as merry and bright as the Ramseys' video greeting card.
We'd like to welcome you to our home and wish you a very Merry Christmas.
She decorated that place with Christmas trees in every room.
Family friend Pam Barday.
She was a Southern belle. Everything was about entertaining.
You say neither, and I say neither.
Patsy always liked to be in the limelight, and she was in the pageant system.
Let's blow the whole thing off.
This is an interesting item I'd like you to see.
The name JonBenét was a fanciful hybrid of her father's, John Bennett.
Pigtails, jeans, beautiful smile. I mean, she was just a mischievous, fun little girl.
JonBenét Ramsey.
At the age of 4, she began following in her mother's footsteps.
JonBenét, thank you.
That Christmas night of 1996, the Ramsey family had been out at a party at a friend's house. As they would tell Barbara Walters in an interview several years later, they got home well after dark.
JonBenét was asleep when we arrived home. We took her to bed, got Burke to bed, set the alarm, and went to sleep.
Before dawn the next morning, Patsy was the first one up. As she headed down this spiral staircase, something catches her eye. Several pieces of paper.
There were 3 pages neatly laid across one of the runs of the stairway.
Pages scrawled with a handwritten, heart-stopping message. It was a ransom note.
Of all of the evidence left behind, that ransom note is the most baffling.
Reporter Diane Diamond has covered the story from the beginning. She says the author of the ransom note seemed to know a lot about the family. The demand for $118,000 was close to the exact amount of John Ramsey's bonus that year.
A ransom note is not that long. A ransom note says, I have your child, I want $1 million, I'll call you later. This is 2.5 pages long. Whoever does that?
I just remember when I read, we have your daughter, it just, this overwhelming fear, and I just dashed back up the stairs as fast as I could and pushed her door open.
And then?
And then I just screamed for John.
JonBenét had vanished.
We are kidnapping. Hurry, please explain to me what's going on. Are you Patsy Ramsey? I'm the mother. Oh my God! Please. I'm sending an officer over, okay? Please. Do you know how long she's been gone? No, I don't. Please, we just got out and she's right here. Oh my God, please.
The call was made to 911, and within 2 or 3 minutes, Patsy Ramsey's on the phone to her friends and neighbors. Come on over.
John was also making calls.
He said, they've got her. What do you mean they've got her? They've kidnapped JonBenét. She's gone.
And people were streaming through that house. They were in the kitchen. They were in the living room.
They're all talking. They're passing the ransom note around.
The police should have secured that scene by telling everybody, get out. I'm sorry, this is a crime scene.
It was just one of many mistakes police made that day. The first detective on the scene also did something that would radically compromise the case.
Linda Arndt tells the restless John, why don't you look around the house, see if anything is missing or looks strange. Start at the top and go to the bottom. But he didn't do that. He went to the basement first, where, of course, whoa, he finds his daughter's body.
I saw her lying on the floor with a white blanket. Her hands were tied above her head. She had tape over her mouth. Her eyes were closed.
And lo and behold, when John Ramsey finds the body, you now have John Ramsey at the crime scene.
John Ramsey picked that little girl up, took the tape off of her mouth, and dragged her upstairs in his arms. And then the coup de grace. He grabs a blanket, which is full of who knows what kind of contaminants, and throws it over the body. Right then and there, the police investigation was tainted.
JonBenét had been strangled with a length of cord, a vicious homemade weapon known as a garrote. She was hit on the head with enormous force, and there was evidence of sexual abuse.
I knelt next to her and I leaned down to her face. And John leaned down opposite me.
In her 1999 interview, Detective Arndt seemed to suggest to Elizabeth Vargas that in that moment, she was afraid of John Ramsey.
And we had a nonverbal exchange that I will never forget. And he asked if she was dead. And I said, yes, she's dead. And as we looked at each other, I remember, and I wore a shoulder holster, tucking my gun right next to me and consciously counting, I've got 18 bullets.
Why did you do that?
Because I didn't know if we'd all be alive when people showed up.
When Patsy Ramsey saw her daughter's body, she collapsed.
I knelt down over her and just laid my body on her body and my cheek against her cheek, and it was cold. And I just kept saying, no, no, you know, ask God. Ask God to raise her.
The kidnapping had just turned into a murder. Speculation about possible suspects begins immediately, and no one can be ruled out.
I know who killed JonBenét. There's no doubt in my mind who killed JonBenét.
And the grand juror, who thinks he knows too.
So I always like to get students perspectives on that, and I wish you were in person to talk about that. But in my opinion, you know, everyone I think has an opinion on who committed that crime and what happened, even just based on that limited video and the information that's provided. I believe that it probably would have been a very easy case to solve had the police not messed up in every way possible. So it is still an unsolved crime, cold case. And I truly believe that the police did not intentionally destroy this case, but you know, it was in a town and a neighborhood that didn't have a lot of crime. And so, you know, they didn't necessarily take the right precautions to secure that crime scene, secure that evidence. So once they realized it was a legitimate crime scene, not just a case of missing child, that it was too late. The evidence, the house itself was, the body was completely tampered with. So, these are usually the questions I ask. Think about if you know the answer. What mistakes do you think that the Boulder Police Department had with securing the crime scene? What specific kinds of evidence, or what was the evidence that was compromised? And was there something they should or could have done different that would have helped solve the crime? I would say yes. I mean, just the fact that they didn't secure the crime scene and the body was not handled correctly, I think plays a major part in why this case was never solved. So like I said, part 1 of this chapter is crime scene investigation, basic information about crime scene investigation, which can also be called CSI. CSI can also be crime scene investigator, so just be aware of that. Part 2 is specifically evidence collection. So crime scene investigation is defined as a multidisciplinary approach where you have scientific professionals and legal professionals working together to solve a crime. Okay, if you have a crime scene, the goal is to always solve the crime. Now, the specific people may not be interested in the outcome of that, like we talked about in the first chapter, but obviously with evidence collection and processing, and then the criminology side, the end goal overall is to, figure out what happened. So on TV, you see people like this walking around. This is from the show CSI, the original. So the true CSI team consists of just general police officers, detectives, medical examiners, if there's a body, which can also be called a coroner, and then the crime scene investigators, which can also be called criminalists, or they can be called forensic investigators, but they're like the science side of it. So what does the CSI team do at the crime scene? Unfortunately, on TV, everyone does everything. Just like we talked about the CSI effect, that's not in real life. Everyone has a specific job depending on their degree, depending on their career path, depending on their specialties. So the police officers are usually the first to arrive to the scene, unless maybe EMT beats them there if they were called. And basically the police officers are just there to basically, start directing activity, start securing the scene, maybe putting some calls in for anything on the criminology side of things that needs to be handled, like search warrants and so forth. The crime scene investigators, the criminalists, the forensic scientists, the forensic investigators, whatever you want to call them, they are there to document the crime scene and collect the evidence. They handle all the evidence. So they're there once the scene is secure and they begin. You may have multiple, depending on the types of evidence that are being collected. Every forensic investigator does have their own specialty. And then they can also conduct field tests, which just means they're actually testing evidence at the scene of the crime instead of taking it back to the lab. The medical examiner or coroner is obviously not called unless there's a body that is deceased. If there's no body, if it's a crime that doesn't involve a person, if it was just a hit and run to a storefront or something, then no coroner is called. And the coroner's main job is to determine manner of death, time of death, things like that. Manner of death can be a natural death, an accidental death, a homicide, which is murder, a suicide, or it could be undetermined. And then the detectives, along with the police, but usually, if it's a high-profile crime or something critical, the detectives are the ones that will start handling the legal aspects and interviewing witnesses and so forth. So priorities of a crime scene. The first priority, no matter the type of crime scene or situation, is safety of all individuals. You want to make sure everyone's safe. So if you can't just run into a crime scene if there's an active hostage situation, or there's a fire or something like that. After everything has been deemed safe, then the preservation of evidence begins. So unfortunately, this is why sometimes evidence does get contaminated or lost, because the safety of individuals may not be a quick thing. Priority number 2, preservation of evidence, basically just means protecting the crime scene and evidence within the crime scene. If it's raining outside, you may put a tarp over tire tracks. If there's a gun, you may put a plastic dome over it with weights so it doesn't get kicked or moved until it's documented by the criminalist. Also, preservation of evidence entails restricting unauthorized persons, so you don't want people just crossing under the crime scene tape. Everyone has a reason to be there. And like I said, securing fragile evidence, taking care of evidence that could potentially be lost, contaminated, moved by accident, or unfortunately on purpose. Okay, so this is the main bulk of this section, the 7 S's of crime scene investigation. So they're kind of like the steps that you do when you get to a crime scene, and each starts with an S. So the first S is securing, specifically the scene. So as we said, this is the job of the first responding officer. It's not the job of EMT or anything like that. It's a first responding officer, which is usually a police officer, not a detective. Their duties are including the safety of the scene and security of the scene, like we just talked about. They will keep a security log of everyone coming and going. The only people that are allowed in are the people that need to be there. And if for some reason something should happen and they need to know who was there at what time, they're worried about tampering or something like that, they have a log of that. And they also may be just collecting relevant evidence and information, such as, what do we need to move forward? Do we need a locksmith to come open this door? Do I need to call the judge to get the search warrant moving, things like that. So securing the scene is number one. After the scene is secured, separating the witnesses if there are any. Number two, so you obviously don't want witnesses talking to each other, so the police, or once the detectives arrive on the scene, they should start talking to witnesses while everything is fresh in their mind. You want to try to separate the witnesses as soon as possible because witnesses can be easily influenced. So if I think the guy had a blue baseball cap on, but then I hear other people saying he had a green baseball cap on, that could basically influence me without realizing it. You don't have to write this down, but just questions they may ask is, when did the crime occur? Because if someone says 6 a.m. and someone says 6 p.m., that's an issue. Who notified law enforcement? That's a big one, because if they can talk to the person that directly called the law enforcement, that sometimes is a tip. Who is the victim? Maybe do you know the victim? Can you identify the perpetrator? Do you know what they were wearing? Do you know who they were? Did you actually see what happened? Did you just hear it? Were you standing on the side and now your only eyewitness observations comes from the crowd talking about it and you didn't actually see anything? Specifically, where were you? If you tell me you saw it, but then I realize there's no way you could have had that vantage point, that's an issue. So just general questions that they would ask the witnesses. And if there are any witnesses, you don't do that step. Okay, scanning the scene. This involves your eyes. So I always tell people, draw eyeballs above the word scanning in your notes. Scanning the scene involves looking with your eyes. It involves a walkthrough. A walkthrough is basically the initial survey of a crime scene, usually done by the lead forensic investigator, whoever that may be at that time. They may have to wait for a forensic investigator to get there, depending on the type of situation, or they may have a police officer or detective take this role if necessary. But basically, they're just walking carefully through the crime scene, trying to get an overall view of what happened and what the plan is to move forward. Who do they need to call? What do they need to do first, and so forth. You also want to determine where the documentation needs to begin. Is there a primary scene? Is there a secondary scene? Is there a tertiary scene? And then who needs to be doing what? Start assigning tasks to these specific forensic investigators. Like I said, kind of a loaded, what do they do when they scan the scene? But it's situational, so it just depends. But all of these things are probably happening kind of all at once. So primary versus secondary crime scene, and there could be tertiaries and so forth. The primary crime scene is where the crime took place. Primary meaning first. Okay, so for example, if a store was robbed, the storefront is the primary crime scene. If someone was shot and killed on First Street by the stoplight, that is the murder scene. That's the primary crime scene. Sometimes that's very obvious. Sometimes it's not. Sometimes you don't know where the primary crime scene occurred because there could be a secondary crime scene. So a secondary crime scene has a very vague definition. It's basically anything related to the initial primary crime scene. So for example, say that there was a robbery, a bank robbery. The suspect's home could be a secondary crime scene. Maybe they go to the house to see, have they been researching on their own computer how to get into the bank? Are there blueprints of the bank? Maybe there was a murder and somebody dumped the body in the river. Okay, the person wasn't killed in the river, but the body was found there. That's a secondary crime scene. Unfortunately, sometimes it's hard to determine what's the primary crime scene, what's a secondary crime scene. There could be multiple crime scenes. Unfortunately, there have been cases of people who have cut up body parts and distributed them on garbage night all throughout the city. So there's lots of crime scenes in that case. Where did it begin? It's hard to tell. Okay, this is why I tell people to put eyeballs on scanning the crime scene, because number 4 is seeing the crime scene. But seeing the crime scene is photography, cameras. Okay, so seeing the scene involves photographing the crime scene. So someone is specialized in this. Unfortunately, in a lot of shows, they don't show you what they actually look like. So in real life, a person would look like this, who is documenting the crime scene with a camera. They're completely covered from head to toe in coveralls, and they have a mask on, they have gloves on. They don't want to contaminate the crime scene with their own DNA or anything like that. And they just take an overall area picture, and then they move up closer and closer and closer to the evidence. They usually take a picture of the evidence with an evidence marker and a ruler, and then they also take a picture with just the evidence marker. The ruler is nice because say you don't collect this this dirt, like you don't make a mold of it, you at least still have a ruler next to it so you can compare sizes. And then just various distances and angles, triangulation. It's all about covering as much of the scene as possible, documenting as much as possible. So if you have to recreate the scene for any reason, you're capable of doing that. Number 5 is sketching the scene. So sometimes sketching comes first and then seeing. So if you get 4 and 5 switched up, that's not a huge deal. Sketching the scene is exactly what it sounds like. Someone actually does a rough drawing of the scene. Why do they do that if they're taking pictures? Well, what happens if something happens to the camera and the film or the SIM card or something is malfunctioning? So they do the same thing. They draw a general outline, and usually it's a rough draft at first, followed by a more detailed picture. So if you're someone who's a good drawer or you like drafting and blueprints, you know, there's a career in forensics with that. Triangulation is just basically using stationary marks to determine distances, kind of geometric and trigonometry style aspects. So if you're good at geometry and trigonometry, then you could be good at this. It's all about the angles. And like I said, a final copy will eventually be done to be used in court, usually in some type of presentation. So I just have a couple pictures to show you of that. So on the left, we have a rough drawing. These are actual crime scene drawings. You can see at the top here is just some general case information and some information about the victim and the investigators. The bottom corner has a legend, okay, with some scale modeling. So this one doesn't look very pretty. Okay, you have a couch, it says couch, table, fireplace. If you look at A down here, it's a cocktail glass that was knocked over. If you look right here, that's a telephone. Here's the body, just a stick drawing for right now. E is measured, or is markings of a blood stain. F is a shell casing. Okay, so it's still detailed, but it's not the best. Now this person, this drawer, artist would go and make a nice final copy. Okay, and it can be by hand or it can be digital, but now you see it's very detailed or more detailed. So the couch is very much up to standards as far as the distance from the wall, the distance from the other wall, so it's accurate. Here's that same cocktail glass. Here's the body. Notice that they have this person face up, okay, and does it say, it doesn't say down here, but sometimes they'll say like the actual positioning. The arms are up and the feet are to the side like it would have been in real life. And then this is the blood stain. So they draw it as accurate as they can get it. Here's another one. This is a rough draft. So it looks a little crazy if you don't know what it is. It's pointing down from an aerial picture of a house. So this is the roof, the front porch, the walkway, the driveway, car, tree, back porch, patio, table, and chairs. Okay, so that's the rough sketch it says right here. And then this is another one that is an aerial picture of like a farm area, forest area. So wheat field, wooded area. These are all trees, a pond, a bridge. So like I said, you can do a sketch of anything. They're now getting better at making digital. So this is a digitalized. So they take a rough sketch and just drop in these objects. So bathtub, toilet, body, and it says right here, face up. Okay, so you can't really tell if it's face up or face down, but they're telling you. Shoe print, it says the size. Number 5, with bloody fingerprint marks. There's blood on the sink. They have the hammer located there. So it's become very much so computerized, but you still need someone to do that rough sketch. Okay, almost done. Number 6, so we have secured the scene, separated witnesses, scanned the scene, done that initial walkthrough. We see the scene with photography. We start documenting. We also sketch the scene, which is interchangeable. Now, everything's been documented. We can actually start searching for evidence. So the lead investigator would do the walkthrough and determine, we need a fingerprint expert, we need a ballistics expert, we need a blood spatter expert, or whatever it may be. Some search patterns that they use are here. These aren't all the search patterns, but these are the common ones. The thing you have to consider, though, before you can actually start searching for the evidence, you have to know your boundaries. So especially if you're in an outside area, say it's a missing person and they're starting, have you ever seen online, they or on the news, they have a line of people and they're walking up and down a field looking for evidence for a missing person or something. You have to know your boundaries because you can't just go outside and walk and walk and walk and forever. So you have to have a well-established boundary, and you also therefore need to know the size of your area and how many investigators are needed, how many volunteers would be needed if it's a big scene. So these are the most common ones. They're kind of self-explanatory. A grid system looks like a grid. So one person walks down, turns around, walks back, turns around, walks down, and then eventually they start crisscrossing over themselves. So you can have one or multiple people for this. Linear is when you walk down, basically pivot, turn around, walk back. Walk down, pivot, turn around, walk back. So it's just back and forth, back and forth. Once again, probably better for multiple people because you can cover more ground. Quadrant is nice if you have a limited number of people or if you have a big area. So it just depends. Quadrant is when you take a crime scene and you break it into grid systems in quadrants. So you can take and maybe, one person's in charge of this, one person's in charge of this. So it kind of gives them more of a focused area for you to work on. Usually when they're excavating and digging up body parts or digging up buried evidence, they use a grid system. That way they're making sure they cover every single bit of ground. And then spiral is usually used if it's a small crime scene that's centralized. So maybe this was like a bomb went off. They start to spiral in to see if there's any pieces or anything of debris outside, and they spiral in. So searching for evidence is pretty standard as far as your definition goes. You just have to make sure that you know where your crime scene's at, the boundaries of that crime scene, and which type of search pattern is going to work best. So the very last thing, once we've searched for evidence and found it, it's been documented by our photography and our sketch artist, then you can start securing the evidence. So all evidence must be properly documented before it can be picked up. Once it's being picked up, it should be properly handled and packaged with appropriate labeling and sealing. Okay, notice everyone has gloves on. This case has I just lost my train of thought. Overalls, like coveralls on. So the next part tomorrow, we'll get into specific evidence collection. So I know that kind of seemed like a lot with the video in the beginning, but make sure you take your notes on this. Make sure you know the 7 S's in order. You will need to know them in order, and just a brief description of each. And then also make sure you know just the general overview of what everyone at the CSI team is and does.